Welcome, everybody. My name is Christopher Scalia. I'm Director of Academic Programs at the American Enterprise Institute, and this is another edition of an ongoing webinar series, partnership between the American Enterprise Institute and the Hertog Foundation. We're doing this and joining in partnership to make sure that you have access to the ideas and thinking of some of America's preeminent policy experts, even though you're away from campus during the coronavirus quarantine. Our guest today is Dr. Nicholas Eberstadt of the American Enterprise Institute. Dr. Eberstadt holds the Henry Wendt Chair in Political Economy at AEI, where he researches and writes extensively on demographics and economic development generally, and more specifically on international security in the Korean Peninsula and Asia. He is also a senior advisor to the National Bureau of Asian Research. His many books include The End of North Korea, The Poverty of the Poverty Rate, and Russia's Peacetime Demographic Crisis. He has offered invited testimony before Congress on numerous occasions and has served as consultant or advisor for a variety of units within the US government. He's appeared on major radio and television news programs, and his writing appears frequently in such outlets as the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. He's here today to talk to us about a couple of very big issues: the present state of North Korea and what the coronavirus means for the future of the global world, the global order. And I'm going to begin, first of all, Dr. Eberstadt, thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate you making time for us today and joining us for this conversation.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I always love having a chance to speak with young men and women in the Hertog program.
Well, it's our pleasure, and I was remarking before the webinar actually began that you are certainly winning the quarantine beard competition, and you are a model for all of the young men trying to do the same thing in their own homes right now.
Well, Google Charlton Heston in the 10 Commandments movie. I'm not quite there.
Very good. So the way this will go is I'm going to ask Dr. Eberstadt a couple of very general questions, and then we're going to devote most of the time to you students at home. So if you have any questions, please use the chat function of Zoom and ask us the questions. You don't need to wait until my little spiel is over to ask those questions. And that way, after about 15 to 20 minutes, we can get right to your questions without any pauses or anything like that. Well, my first question for you, Nick, is well, it's really kind of a three-parter. It's simple, it's direct, but it's not necessarily an easy question. Mm-hmm. What do we know about the situation in North Korea right now? For example, is Kim Jong-un alive? And what is the coronavirus doing there exactly?
I'm fascinated by the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, in part because it's such a hard research problem. It provides such a challenging puzzle. The North Korean state is a very hard target. It's the most completely closed and controlled society on the planet. The regime, the masters of the regime are also past masters of strategic deception. And information that trickles into the outside world is a sort of a swamp of rumors and lies. So you're kind of a little bit like Agatha Christie's detective Miss Marple when you try to research this and figure out what is what. On the basis of the very limited information that we have, if I try to peer through the glass darkly, this is my interpretation. And I stress this is an interpretation. I don't actually know what's going on inside there. Kim Jong-un didn't tell me. First of all, it seems quite clear that the COVID-19 pandemic is being regarded as a regime imperiling emergency of the sort that North Korean leadership hasn't faced perhaps since the invasion by Douglas MacArthur. in the early part of this Korean War. North Korean press or propaganda is using phrases that we haven't seen in my memory. In any case, they're talking about this circumstance as being a matter of national existence and survival. They're warning that there are catastrophic, irreversible consequences that may befall the country because of it. The catastrophic, irreversible consequences are usually what they threaten Japan and South Korea with, not something they mention for themselves. The reason that the regime is so alarmed or maybe even panicked, I think is pretty clear. They are woefully unprepared and poorly equipped to cope with something like COVID-19. And unlike the famine a generation ago, which killed hundreds of thousands, but which the regime rode out, starvation isn't contagious. This is contagious and could kill people in the highest reaches of authority. So Kim Jong-un has been playing a North Korean version of the game Where's Waldo since this crisis began. The regime declared a national quarantine emergency on January 30th. This is 3 months old at this point. He's come up for air a couple of times to lay a wreath on his dad's mausoleum on Kim Jong-il's birthday in February, for example. He did not come up for Grandpa's birthday, which is April 15th. And for the last, since April 11th, since the Politburo meeting on April 11th, there's been no photo, hide, nor hair of him in North Korean media. And so this has led to all sorts of wonderful stories on the internet that I'm sure you've seen. He's brain dead, he's in a vegetative state, he's dead, a doctor botched a heart operation, he got gravely injured by shrapnel at an explosion at a missile test site. Chinese doctors have been rushed in to save him, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can find all of that stuff online if you want to look for it. I don't know if the guy is alive or dead, but I can tell you this. Occam's razor, which isn't always a perfect predictor, but it's a pretty good start for rational reasoning, says that the simplest explanation for his absence from the stage is COVID-19 and protect the king. At all costs, protect the king. The most important doctrine that you've never heard of in North Korean ideology is the 10 principles of monolithic ideology. You can Google it. It's like the tablets from Mount Sinai, North Korean style. Precept 10, which is last and perhaps most significant, is that the revolution proceeds in a hereditary fashion, which means that the royal family must be protected at all costs. All you need to know is that to have a storyline that plausibly explains why the guy is out of sight so much. Okay, but there are little strange quirks and curiosities that also have to be noted. Why did the guy not pay his respects to his grandfather, who was the regime founder, whose speaking style and hairdo he imitates? When he went and paid respects to his father's really widely reviled in North Korea. Why didn't he go to the regime founder's grave? Also, what is going on now with the sort of the Weekend at Bernie's phenomenon in the North Korean press, where there are no pictures, not even photoshopped pictures, not even stock film, footage of Kim Jong-un in recent days and now weeks, but instead little notices about a note or message that was sent to a foreign dignitary or a military troop in the DPRK bearing his signature. And finally, I don't know if you've ever taken a look at this picture of this guy, but he's a sort of a walking advertisement for a heart attack. He's morbidly obese. He's a chain smoker. He's youthful. He's 36, I think they say. But if you did a kind of a health years assessment of him, his health age would be, I don't know, 85, 90, something like that. He is someone who we would not be surprised to hear have been stricken by an unexpected medical episode. So none of that tells us that he is actually ill. He may well come up again at a time and place of his choosing, because at the end of the day, the North Korea's supreme leader is only accountable to himself.
Rookie mistake. I did that last time too. Sorry. I forgot to unmute myself. Thank you very much. That's a very thorough answer, and it included a good Netflix recommendation during the quarantine, Weekend at Bernie's. I'm not sure everybody got that reference, but it's a cultural touchstone everybody should know. Okay, so I'm going to change directions slightly a little bit, and this is going to be, again, another big can of worms for you to dig into. But more broadly speaking, what are some of the possible consequences that the pandemic will have on what you call Pax Americana, that is the global order since approximately World War II?
Well, so of course I may be wrong, but my preliminary assessment is that we are weeks into a world-changing crisis, and that things will never be quite the same again for any of us for the rest of our lives. I regard the COVID pandemic as a milestone that's going to change the trajectory and the dynamics of international and domestic life, well, certainly for as long as I stick around here. The reason I say this is because I think that Mr. COVID virus has a mind of his own, and like it or not, he has the final say over our social and economic arrangements for the foreseeable future. This is a very new, it's a novel coronavirus. It's a zoonotic infection that we have no natural resistance to because it's jumped to humans from bats for the first time. And this being the case, we're subjected to a contagion which is not just unfamiliar to our immunosystems, but designed in a different and very dangerous way. It's highly contagious. It's spread by asymptomatic super spreaders. It's quite lethal, and we have no immunity to it, and we have no serum or inoculation for it. And thus far, scientists on planet Earth are 0 for 4 in coming up with an inoculation for a SARS type virus. So I expect this is going to change economic life in the world for quite a while, and perhaps quite gravely. So far the economic impact, I think, has been clearly underestimated. at least on a week-by-week basis, we see how underestimated it is when Wall Street's finest consistently underestimate how much in the way of job loss we're going to have each week. Likewise, underestimating the estimated drop in GDP and sales of various things and so forth. I'm not quite sure or convinced that we're going to have this V-shaped recovery that we're hearing all about. It sounds to me a little bit like in another sort of analogy to a wartime situation, a little bit like the talk in previous conflicts about the boys all coming home by Christmas. I'm not sure the boys are all going to be home by Christmas. And this being said, we may be in for a long and difficult economic slog. I'm not trying to be a bearer of bad news. I'm just trying to assess as clearly as we can through the fog of war. It's probably going to be much worse in poor countries than in the United States or Japan or other OECD countries. And that's because their governing capacity is more limited, their public health systems are decidedly more limited, and their populations are much closer to the bone and much more vulnerable to international economic shocks. There's already a big plummet in demand for the sorts of things that many low-income countries export, commodities, minerals. Likewise, I think there's going to be a big shock in remittances from abroad to populations in these countries. So even apart from the contagion itself, I think there's going to be a crisis of human need in many places that's going to be very, very, very tough to watch. Now, we will get out of the COVID crisis one way or another. Either we'll have a cure, or we'll come up with herd immunity, or we'll come up with a way of managing until herd immunity. After that, I think that the world order is going to be different in some important ways. You will recall that there was an earlier era of globalization before our current era, from about, let's say, 1870 until 1914. Big international trade, movement of people, commerce, investment, real globalization. That more or less came to an end. It came pretty crashing down when World War I erupted. After World War II, the United States helped instrumentally to fashion a new era of globalization with what you mentioned, Chris, with what we call Pax Americana, with a set of international institutions for trade and finance and also for security that made possible an extraordinary fluorescence of commerce and investment and travel and research and culture and education, communication, and all the rest. I'm not so much of a pessimist that I anticipate our second era of globalization to be destroyed by COVID, but I think it may take a pretty big whack at it. And after COVID, my guess is that globalization won't quite look the same. It's kind of hard to imagine more or less open travel the way we've all grown up knowing it, for example. I think that words like Davos, which I think you all are familiar with, may seem a little bit antiquated to subsequent generations. It may be like the interwar period when people experimented with Esperanto or something for the universal language that nobody knows about anymore. I expect there'll be a lot more talk of national interest, and that economic nationalism will come roaring back. There'd be less willingness or interest in global international coordination than we had in the past. And where that leads to, I don't quite know. I expect that we're going to have to deal with the awful problem that we neglected or didn't want to look at, which is the question of how we go from here with a China dominated by a Chinese Communist Party, which does not share any of our international values, and which in fact is hostile to them, is more powerful than ever before. And as we've now seen with this terrible strategic surprise, was responsible for the awful magnification of the pandemic. If a government other than CCP-run government, if let's say if a Taiwan-style government had been operating in Wuhan at the time of the first detection of infections, the world wouldn't be dealing with the same sort of crisis that we are now. So there are many other things we're going to have to take into account as we figure out where we go with China. But at the end of the day, Pax Americana is, I think, more at risk from dissatisfaction within our country than threats from without. And there has been growing dissatisfaction in our country with the obligations of being the world's policeman and lender of last resort and all the rest. And I don't think this dissatisfaction is entirely irrational. And I don't think that people who object are suffering from delusionary afflictions. If you look at what's been happening in our country over the last 2 generations, you'll see, for example, that prime age men, 25 to 54, have experienced sort of Great Depression era employment rates before this crash that we're entering into now. So things haven't been working out really well for everybody. And if you look at what's happened with wealth formation for the bottom half of our country, according to the Fed, the real per household net worth of the bottom half of our country was actually lower last year than the year before the Berlin Wall came down. It's about a third lower. And so I think people in those households can be excused for asking what the end of the Cold War has done for them. So I think economic times are going to be harder, not easier, for the immediate future. And there may be more questions about America's continuing involvement. And the response, I think, to those questions shouldn't be shut up and take it. I think the response should be devising a formula that credibly promises prosperity for all, that promises prosperity for the little people too, for the 51% who, in our system that depends upon consent of the governed, are critical for any sort of policy to proceed. We need to give a lot more thought to that, I think, all across the political spectrum. We need to give a lot more thought to that than has been devoted so far.
We have a number of questions from students coming in. So just a reminder, those of you watching at home, you can ask Nick questions using the Q&A function. I think I misspoke earlier and said chat function, but use the Q&A function on Zoom, and we'll take those questions and we will ask him. So let me start with a question from Alec Greven. Has a question about the coronavirus in North Korea. He says North Korea is one of the most isolated countries in the world, and they also seem comfortable using brutal methods to solve policy problems. He asks, how is COVID-19 a significant threat to this country, meaning North Korea? Their isolation would seem to be a benefit to limiting disease transmission from other countries, and their brutal methods would seem to assist them in quickly repressing the spread of the disease.
I mean, excellent question. And if the North Korean Ministry of Public Security could execute the virus, then everybody would be happy. The problem is that the virus is relentless, and it won't stop hunting people in North Korea after its first introduction to the DPRK. Now, you don't have to have security clearance to see the news reports that suggest that COVID has already made a debut in North Korea, despite the government's boast that there are no cases. I mean, the military, the entire military, that's a big population, was reportedly, this is from the commander of US forces in Korea, was reportedly shut down for an entire month. No flights, no exercises, no nothing. That's very unusual. The Army Day Parade was canceled without explanation on February 8th. I'd say there are rumors, there are stories, there are news reports about almost 200 people, almost 200 soldiers along the border dying, and in such large numbers that they couldn't cremate them. Likewise, reports of deaths at the Gulag camps. I mean, barracks and Gulag camps are just petri dishes. They've set up a system of, kind of carburetors for turbocharging the infection throughout society. And it's also rumored that the chief of the general staff of the Korean People's Army had to be put into quarantine. So it's not just the little people, again, who seem to be affected by this. And that's in the nature of a pandemic like this. The Johns Hopkins Global Security Index ranks North Korea as number 193 out of 195 countries in terms of preparations to deal with the pandemic. And the only reason that they're not at the bottom is because Somalia and Equatorial Guinea happen to exist. So that situation is not going to change. The North Korean control system may be able to cordon off outbreaks, kind of like playing whack-a-mole, if they're absolutely ruthless. And the rumors are that a new sort of martial law has gone into effect since the quarantine emergency, which is kind of harsh and brutal even by North Korean standards. But even that cannot prevent contagion. And the contagion will be invited, as we talk about here with our country, as soon as lockdown ends. North Korea can afford lockdown much less than we can, because North Korea is so close to the bone. And in attempting an absolutely severe lockdown, the leadership is gambling that a famine is better than the pandemic. But the problem is, by getting a famine, you may also get a pandemic in the bargain too.
We have many questions about the dear leader of North Korea. A couple from Anonymous. What would the death of Kim Jong-un mean for the future of North Korea and the world? And then either the same Anonymous or just somebody with the same name, which would be quite a coincidence, wants to know about the online rumors about Kim's health. I'm sure you've seen these about, there's a rumor about a statement released by his sister, and is she a possible successor? And is the significance of her role in the regime shifting due to the virus?
So it certainly would be an unexpected disaster that the regime is systemically unprepared for. The North Korean system cannot prepare for the death of its supreme leader, because if there were a organized and rational plan for succession, that would be tantamount to a conspiracy to overthrow the government. Do you see what I mean? So it has to be haphazard and ad hoc. Now, because of the aforementioned 10 principles that I referred to, something called the Paek-2 bloodline matters a whole lot in North Korean politics and ideology. Paek-2 is a big, at least in photos, it's a big, beautiful mountain that looks kind of like Crater Lake out in Oregon. And the mythology is that this is where the godlike family of the Kims of Pyongyang originated from. That's why they call it the Paektu bloodline. Uh, the regime is so fused into the Kim family ideology that it's very hard to imagine somebody other than a family member being at least the nominal head of the regime. So there's a certain amount of thumb sucking about how woke the Kims are and how woke the North Koreans are. Could they stand to have a female be the head of their regime, or are they so patriarchal that they have to have a guy? Well, if they have to have a guy, the maybe the most obvious candidate would be a somewhat elderly brother of the late Kim Jong-il, named Kim Byung-il, who was sent out of the country when Jong-il was running the show. He was pastored out as ambassador to Finland, ambassador to Czechoslovakia. It's amazing that the diplomatic corps doesn't know more about this guy. You'd think they'd want to, but maybe they were asleep for a couple of decades. So that'd be one idea. I guess I can't know, but I'd want to pay more attention to Kim Jong-un's blood sister, Kim Yo-jong. She's younger than him. She's probably in her early 30s. She may or may not be married, may or may not have children. She was sent down to South Korea for North Korea's charm offensive during the Pyeongchang Olympics in 2018. And certainly carried herself well and was, presentable little dictator. She was perfectly good. She is now the de facto chief of propaganda and agitation in North Korea. And that's a very important job. By the way, when I mentioned that the papers were just doing this kind of catfish-like thing where they had, somebody might have assumed Kim Jong-un's identity and be sending off these love letters to people abroad and to soldier groups at home. The person who has to sign off on that at the end of the day is the propaganda chief. That's the sister. The sister's the one who says it's okay to do this. And this may also be accumulating influence and power. Last month, for example, she took it on herself to publicly discuss and respond to President Trump's letter to her brother. It's a little unusual. And the month before that, one of the most important organs in the North Korean system is something called the Organization and Guidance Department of the Korean Workers' Party, OGD. The boss of that was publicly denounced and disgraced for corruption. So he probably isn't running that show anymore. We haven't heard who the new boss is, but I have a guess. When we eventually hear about that, I've got a guess that it's going to be Sis. So if her brother is incapacitated, she would be I think a strong candidate for ruler, or else as a sort of a regent until Kim Jong-un's children are old enough to assume power themselves, assuming the system lasts that long. But that would be one way of maintaining dynastic succession.
Let's take a look at a couple of questions about coronavirus here in the States. You wrote, this is from Dallas Castens. Mm-hmm. He points out that you read a couple of weeks ago, you wrote that coronavirus could wipe out old and inefficient business models, like perhaps the university system. Could you elaborate a little bit on how that might happen and what might replace it?
Sure. Well, I wasn't suggesting that this would be like a devastation from the plague. I didn't mean it would wipe them out that way. What I was trying to suggest is that there are business models in the US and abroad today that we know are kind of like old and broken. And the economic shock from COVID is going to put a lot of pressure on dead business models that are still walking. Let's put it that way. So for instance, what am I thinking of? Well, I mean, look at what's happening already with offices, with office life. I don't think that offices are going to be the same anymore after the COVID emergency. People realize that, you know, it's costly, inefficient. We don't need quite as much of it. There are a lot of different ways we can be more flexible. Or take a look at something like law firms. I mean, law firms have this antique 19th century, you know, almost Marxian sort of notion that their value is determined by the number of hours billed by legal, rather than by the services and results that legal gets. I expect that's going to get a much more serious look now that everybody's looking at what they're spending for legal. You know, universities the same way. The universities in the U.S. and to a lesser extent overseas, but I'm thinking the U.S., have become, they have resisted reform. They have become cartelized, price-insensitive bastions of non-competition. And I think the bastions of non-competition are going to have a huge battering ram that slams them, let's say, around fall semester this coming year. And I don't know how hard it's going to slam. I don't know for how long it's going to slam. But the whole sort of non-competitive price-fixing aspect of University Inc., I think is going to get a really hard second look, not least by the students and families that finance so much of their existence. Just a guess.
We have not heard, this is a question from Albert, we haven't heard much about Pakistan and India during all of this, and both of those countries have densely packed populations and weak healthcare systems. Pakistan is facing a locust plague, which sharply increases famine prospects. Also, the PAK government has allowed people to go to the mosques for prayer. Do you predict a catastrophe in the region, or will its young demographics and warm climate prevent that sort of catastrophe?
It's an excellent question, and I don't know the answer, but I would think that those would be big red flashing lights. Of course, you point out the demographics of the youthful population. That's important. But remember, we're still learning about Mr. Coronavirus, and he seems to have some pretty naughty habits. Even for survivors, we're seeing the sorts of damage that we don't usually expect in influenza. You know, renal damage and kidney damage, liver damage, heart damage, all of the blood clots we're hearing about. We haven't heard about neurological damage yet, but I'd say stay tuned. We may be learning something about that. This we know from people who are survivors with identified symptoms of coronavirus. There's a whole phalanx of people who are asymptomatic. And we haven't even begun yet to investigate what sorts of long-term health problems they themselves may bear. So I think there's plenty of room for concern, even for youthful countries. And in India, this whole almost freedom at midnight sort of forced migration of enormous numbers of poor people across the country to go back to their homes and villages. I mean, I think that just risks risks all sorts of tragic consequences. I understand what the intention was there, of course. I'm sure you do too. But I guess we will wait and see. My friend and colleague at AEI, Derek Scissors, who's a specialist on China and India, but on China's economy, wrote, I think, a very important paper you can look up online if you haven't seen it yet. It's short, trying to analyze what COVID may really have done in China as opposed to the official claims, which are lies, obvious lies. Derek's assessment was that without getting too sensational, it seemed like it was a pretty moderate back of the envelope estimate that something like 3 million people in China, rather than the 80,000 claimed, may have been infected. And that, what does that mean? 40 times as many people may have died as were claimed. If that's the sort of scale of what we really should have seen happening in China, if we had an honest, accountable government there, this, I think, gives us pause about what may lie in store for India. And if, these are all ifs, if it is true that the coronavirus at this stage before future mutations is lethal for 0.5%, 1% of people exposed to it, do the arithmetic for India. So bad things could be ahead.
Let's talk a little bit more about China. When this subsides, when the pandemic subsides a little bit, and we return to something approaching normalcy, what do you think the new normal with China, with America's relations with China look like? How are we going to contain them after this? Do you think kind of alliance networks are the best way to approach that, or empowering other nations to handle that is the better way to go? Or do you have another vision for how we can approach China relations?
Well, it's a very important question, Chris. To start, I would propose, say it's just a guess, but my guess is that the Communist Party of China, the CCP, is in the middle of an extraordinary crisis, as we're talking today, by Zoom. I think they were in crisis mode before COVID, because last year CCP suffered a humiliating and unmitigated defeat in Hong Kong, which they regard as their home territory, by the freedom-loving people of Hong Kong. And that was a big defeat that made the government look little and weak. I'm not a fan of trade wars, but President Trump's trade confrontation with China, I think, exposed internationally China's economic vulnerability and dependence upon the outside world. And that was a reveal that, again, is critical for a regime like the CCP. When COVID struck and the Chinese government shut down so much of the country, they necessarily assured that the economy would go into vapor lock. And we may have seen some recent figures released by Chinese officialdom about the first declines in GDP since Mao. All of those figures are lies. All of those figures are doctored in the sort of a Chinese version of Watergate, the modified limited hangout The best lie they could get away with making the problem look as small as they possibly thought would be, not laugh out loud to the outside world. The drop in economic performance is much greater than the 6.8% in the quarter. I mean, some of the stuff that they can't lie about, like auto sales, because we've got figures on that. Auto sales are down like 42%. This isn't any 6.8% drop of GDP. Which means that for a dictatorship that has a sort of an implicit formula or contract with the subjects, you shut up and we'll bring you the benefits, having an enormous catastrophic economic setback can only be a crisis. It can only be a crisis. So we'll want to see what happens to the infallible Xi Jinping in the months ahead. Stay tuned. We as outsiders urgently need an international, impartial, blue ribbon scientific panel to investigate the origins of this catastrophe. I wouldn't prejudge what they will find, but we need to know how this disaster was visited on humanity, and what the Chinese government did and did not do to bring devastation to the rest of our planet. As far as coping with China, or coping with a China run by the CCP, which I think is really the problem here, there's a lot we can do in international security policy, some of which we're already doing, some of which we probably need to redouble. But there's an aspect I don't think we have yet begun to look at. COVID as metaphor, let's say. COVID should reveal to us the terrible strategic miscalculation that we made in our decades-long engagement with China. So there were many, many good things that came from engaging China, and pulling China into the world order, bringing China into the world economy, allowing China to enter into the apparatus of international governance to the extent there is one. But we have all socially enjoyed a lot of benefits from China's economic rise. What was not understood and not anticipated was the downside of bringing into an American order and into the American economy a decision maker like the CCP, whose interests are so antithetical to our own. And now we find our economy and the economy of our allies and the international system so deeply entwined with CCP-run China. We're going to have to do a really careful and clear-eyed diagnostic to think about which aspects of this interrelationship are in our interests and which are not. And this is going to be very, very difficult. It'll take a long time, and dealing with it is probably going to be a question that's going to preoccupy business and government for decades.
As long as you were talking a little bit about the American economy there, and you discussed a little bit about kind of a turn you see coming, national economic interest in America. So a couple of students, Libby Krieger and Ryan Schinkel, have related questions along those lines. Libby says that since you mentioned there might be a shift back to economic nationalism, do you think conservative Republicans will have a political advantage in coming years, or do you think it's possible liberal Democrats lessen their focus on globalism as a result of this shift? And then Ryan relatedly wants to know, Actually, why don't you start with that one, and then
Sure.
I'll read you Ryan's question.
Well, my guess is that in the United States and in other affluent societies, there's going to be a pretty serious rethink of international supply chains and value chains. We might not want to have all of our pharmaceuticals manufactured in the PRC. We might not want to have a lot of different IT and communications equipment vulnerable to interruptions from PRC. We may want to return source rather than outsource aspects of our supply chain, even if it's less efficient and less profitable for reasons of security. And there may be a lot more things along this avenue. Now, does such a prospect advantage the current Republican Party or the current Democratic Party? I'm not sure it's as clear cut as we might think. I mean, some of this will depend upon how carefully political leaders in each party think about the problems at hand. I mean, just as a generalization, I don't think that the Democratic Party has a whole big problem with statism. So if we want to have a statist response to dealing with these questions, some wings or some circles in the Democratic Party may actually have a comparative advantage with this. I don't know how this will unfold yet, but my guess is that there will be all sorts of new thinking and new arguments and debates. At least I hope so.
Do you see that along those lines? Do you see this as an opportunity, the turn to national economic interest? Do you see that as potentially good news for the men without work you spent so much time writing about?
I would say I was dealing with a pre-war problem, and we're now in wartime. We have a wartime problem. If we were talking about the era that we've left behind, I would have said that more economic nationalism would not be more than a marginal benefit for this group, and I'll tell you why. Number one, resourcing international supply chains, I think generally, unless we make big innovations and improvements, which we could, will make production more costly and less profitable. And I'd expect that to have a negative impact on the demand for work. Number two, although what I was describing in Men Without Work was a phenomenon of exit from the labor force that to some degree was due to structural problems in the economy, transformation of the economy, drop in demand for labor in general and less skilled labor, less educated labor in particular. An awful lot of that couldn't be explained in structural terms. A lot of it had to do with what we might call supply side problems, or even with institutional barriers like the enormous invisible army of men who have a felony in their background and find it much more difficult to get back into the labor force than they would otherwise. I don't think that economic nationalism is going to appreciably alter those phenomena. It could be that if our country and our society, so to speak, awakens to a national emergency, that will even extend to the men on the couch, to get off the couch. But I'm not sure that that a national economic overhaul would create enough demand per se to yank them off the couch.
Ryan Schinkel wants to know to what degree the current pandemic and the quarantine, the economic slowdown, everything related to that, how much that will exacerbate the social, psychological, and again, economic consequences that predated the shutdown itself.
Well, I don't think we can know yet, but I'd guess a lot. I mean, count on your fingers. As of 8:30 this morning, the last 5 weeks of jobless claim reports total 30 million people out of work. It's a lot of people out of work. We've seen a precipitous drop in spending and a precipitous drop in rent paying and mortgage paying and credit card paying and auto loan paying. So in this particular crisis, unlike the Great Recession, which some of you may be old enough to recall dimly, that crisis, the financial panic caused the financial shock caused the employment shock. We're in a situation, I think, where the employment shock is going to cause the financial shock. And so it'll take a couple of months of non-payment before the non-bank financial institutions and so forth and so on, kind of like start to get to a point of panicking about going into vapor lock from non-payment and over leveraging and so forth. My guess is that the ongoing reverberations will cause psychology to change a lot. It's going to, I think, make people more interested in saving money for emergencies than in maxing out their credit cards, unless they're sure that they can just throw away their credit cards and never have to pay them. And it may make people much more mindful of finding work to support themselves and their families. But I'm just peering through a glass darkly at this point. I can't know.
Well, speaking of peering through a glass darkly, let's move back to North Korea for the last question. I think will probably be the last question. It's just I think an interesting question about how we can know anything about what's going on in North Korea. Spike Deering asks, what outlets, sources do you consult to access reliable information?
So, what do they say when you watch this on TV? Don't do this at home, kids.
Yeah.
I spend a lot of time reading North Korean propaganda because I know it's North Korean propaganda and I know it's the official word of the regime. And I think that reading the texts matter. And sometimes, even if they're liars, sometimes they tell the truth by mistake, inadvertently. And sometimes they tell it the truth because they actually mean something that they're saying. But I pay much more attention than maybe some other people who are in this misbegotten racket. At this point, there are now a couple of million cell phones in North Korea, so communications is no longer absolutely watertight. This means that a lot more rumors, rumors have to be, bathed in a bath of salt, right? But a lot more rumors get it to the outside world. I pay attention to some of the news sources like NK News and Daily NK and Radio Free Asia that report on these. I take a look at some of the South Korean press. I have there are a couple of scholars whose work I think is absolutely fantastic in this area. I think they're gold standard. Robert M. Collins, who writes for the hrnk.org, the U.S. Committee for Human Rights in North Korea. Full disclosure, I'm a founding board member of HRNK. He is fantastic on North Korean decision making and has written a number of books that you can find about that. Professor Brian R. Myers, author of The Cleanest Race and the Myth of Juche, is, in my view, a prophet without honor. I think he is clearer and better on North Korean ideology and worldview than South Korean scholars in the country where he is professing. So I mentioned those two as a shout out if you want to follow up on things.
That's all we have time for. Dr. Eberstadt, thank you very much for your time today and for your insights, for sharing your thoughts with us. We really appreciate you taking time to speak to us all today. I also want to thank our friends at the Hertog Foundation for helping organize this event. And thank you to all of you watching and sending us questions from home. We really appreciate your time and your questions. This will probably be the last in this partnership series for a few weeks because you guys might be busy with exams and papers and things like that are still going on. But stay tuned. We hope to return during the summer with more events like this. So be on the lookout for more invitations from us. In the meantime, good luck with your exams and your papers, and enjoy the start of your summer and stay safe. Thanks very much.
Bye-bye, guys.